Imagine a country where a man could own your fields, your labor, and a piece of every loaf of bread you baked. And he had never met you and never would. Imagine a kingdom where a single family in a single palace decided who could speak, who could pray, who could read, and who could be buried in holy ground. For nearly 1,000 years, that country was France. That system stretched across almost all of Europe, and for the people living inside it, it did not feel like a system at all. It felt like the natural order of the universe, as fixed and unquestionable as the sunrise. Then, in the space of a few violent years, it was gone, not reformed, not adjusted, torn out by the roots. The question this video is going to answer is not simply what was the French Revolution. It's older and stranger and more unsettling than that. The real question is, what kind of world has to exist for people to burn it down? What had to be built over centuries, layer by layer, law by law, prayer by prayer, to make an entire population accept hunger, servitude, and silence as the will of God? Before we can understand why the Bastille fell, we have to understand the world it was holding up. Because underneath the powdered wigs and the palace of Versailles, there was a machine. A machine of taxation, faith, blood, and fear, engineered so precisely that for centuries, almost no one thought to ask whether it could be broken. This is the story of that machine and the moment in the final years of the 18th century when it began, for the first time, to shake. Every European kingdom in this period had a king, an army, and borders on a map, but layered on top of every single one of them was something else. Something with its own courts, its own taxes, its own soldiers, and its own territory. It answered to no king. It was the Catholic Church. The Pope was not simply the most important religious figure in Europe. He commanded the Papal States, a genuine territory in central Italy, with its own government and its own revenue. Bishops sat as lords over enormous estates. Cardinals held political influence rivaling princes. Monasteries functioned as landowners, employers, and banks. The church ran its own legal system, judging clergy and certain crimes under canon law rather than royal law, a separate justice for a separate world within the world. And the church had a weapon no king could match: excommunication. To be cast out of the church was not simply a spiritual punishment. In a deeply Catholic society, it could dissolve a ruler's legitimacy in the eyes of his own subjects. Kings had gone to war rather than risk it. Beneath all of this sat the tithe, a tax owed to the church by nearly everyone, collected in addition to whatever the king and the local lord already demanded. The church also held something even more valuable than land or gold: control over knowledge itself. It shaped education, dominated the universities, and held enormous influence over which books could be printed and read. The Inquisition, though its power varied by country and had weakened considerably by the 18th century, remained a symbol of how far the church would go to guard the boundaries of acceptable belief. Europe had states, but standing above those states was an invisible second state, one that touched every soul from birth to burial and answered to no ballot, no parliament, and almost no earthly authority at all. If the church was untouchable, the king was something even stranger: sacred. The doctrine of the divine right of kings held that a monarch's authority came directly from God, not from the consent of his people. Coronations were built as theater to prove this: anointing with holy oil, sacred relics, the presence of bishops and archbishops confirming publicly that this man had been chosen by heaven itself. This had a brutal political consequence. If the king ruled by God's will, then resisting him was not simply illegal, it was sin. The church did not just tolerate this arrangement, it actively sustained it, blessing coronations and reinforcing from every pulpit in the land that obedience to the crown was obedience to God. Loyalty and faith were fused into a single, inseparable duty. This is the first thing to understand about the world the revolution destroyed. Rebellion wasn't just risky. It was, in the eyes of millions, an offense against the creator of the universe. Picture French society as a pyramid, and understand this: almost nobody who was born near the bottom would die anywhere else. At the top sat the nobility, a small fraction of the population who held vast privileges, including exemption from many taxes. Below them, the clergy, who occupied their own tier with its own legal protections. Beneath these two came the so-called third estate, everyone else, the bourgeoisie, merchants, lawyers, and professionals with growing wealth but no equivalent political power, urban workers and craftsmen, subject to guild rules and precarious wages. And at the base of it all, peasants and serfs, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population and carried, quite literally, the weight of the entire structure on their backs. Social mobility existed in theory. In practice, it was almost non-existent. You were born into your class, you lived by its rules, and you died within it. The pyramid did not just describe French society, it was the architecture that held the entire order in place. Underneath the social pyramid was an economic engine, feudalism. Land in the countryside was held by lords, often nobles. Sometimes the church itself. Peasants worked that land but rarely owned it. In exchange for the right to farm it, they owed dues, labor obligations, and a portion of their harvest to the landholder above them. Serfdom in its harshest medieval form had faded in France by the 18th century, but the underlying structure of obligation had not. Manors still organized rural life. Peasants still worked fields that were not theirs, on terms they had not chosen, for a lord they had rarely spoken to. The agricultural economy of France still ran on a simple, unbreakable principle. Whoever owned the land controlled the people living on it. Statistics can describe a system. They cannot make you feel it. So picture 4 different mornings in the same kingdom, on the same day. A peasant wakes before sunrise to work fields that belong to someone else. After the harvest, a share goes to the lord, a share goes to the church as tithe, and a share goes to the king as tax, often leaving barely enough to survive on. Hunger is a constant companion, not an emergency. Disease spreads easily through crowded, undernourished communities. Life expectancy is short, and child mortality is devastatingly high, a reality so common that grief for many families becomes almost routine. A noble, elsewhere, wakes to servants, spends the day at a hunting party or preparing for an evening ball, and enjoys sweeping exemptions from the very taxes crushing the peasantry below. A priest rises for the day's religious services, but much of his role is administrative, managing parish records, collecting the tithe, and overseeing what little education rural children receive. And in Paris, ordinary city dwellers navigate crowded, muddy streets, haggle in crowded marketplaces, and often wait in bread lines. Because bread was not just food in 18th century France. It was survival, and its price could mean the difference between an ordinary week and a desperate one. 4 lives, 1 kingdom, 1 system holding all of them in place, each in a completely different way. Now look again at that peasant's life, and notice something. The church is present at every single stage of it. Birth is marked by baptism. Education, where it exists at all, is delivered through the church. Marriage is a religious sacrament, not simply a legal contract. Weekly worship is mandatory in practice, if not always in law. And at the end of life, the church presides over death, the funeral, and the burial itself, deciding in effect who receives a proper Christian resting place and who does not. There was no stage of existence the church didn't touch. It was not one institution among many. It was the framework inside which an entire life was lived, from the first sacrament to the last. Here is a detail that rarely gets the attention it deserves. For most of this history, the average person could not read the Bible for themselves, not simply because books were scarce, though they were, but because the church's Bible was in Latin, a language almost no ordinary peasant understood. Literacy itself was rare outside the clergy, the nobility, and the growing bourgeoisie. Universities existed, but they served a narrow, privileged sliver of the population, and they operated largely under religious oversight. The printing press, invented centuries earlier, had already begun loosening this grip on knowledge. But by the 18th century, its slow-burning effects were only beginning to truly threaten the old order. Whoever controlled access to books controlled access to ideas. And for a very long time, in France, that control sat firmly with the church and the crown. Now put the pieces together, because this is where the story turns from atmosphere into arithmetic. A French peasant did not pay one tax. He paid three: taxes to the king, dues and labor obligations to his feudal lord, and the tithe to the church. Three separate authorities, each with its own justification, each reaching into the same harvest, the same household, the same exhausted family. By the time all three had taken their share, what remained in the peasant's own hands was often barely enough to survive the winter, let alone to prosper, save, or escape the class he had been born into. This was not a single unfair tax. It was three overlapping systems of extraction, layered on top of one another for centuries, each treating its share as sacred, permanent, and beyond question. By the 18th century, France stood at the center of this entire European order. It held one of the continent's largest populations and one of its most formidable armies. French had become the language of diplomacy across royal courts from Madrid to St. Petersburg. Paris was a cultural capital whose influence stretched across the continent, and ruling over all of it sat the Bourbon dynasty, one of the oldest and most prestigious royal houses in Europe. If the old order had a single showcase, a building meant to prove to the whole world that this system was permanent, majestic, and untouchable, it wasn't in Paris at all. It was a few miles outside the city in a palace built from a hunting lodge. Versailles is usually described as simply a palace. It was something far more calculated. Louis XIV had built it not merely to impress, but to control. By drawing the most powerful nobles in France away from their own regional estates and into a single glittering court, he could keep them close, watched, distracted, and dependent on royal favor rather than building independent bases of power in the provinces. Versailles was, in a very real sense, a gilded cage, and the nobility competed fiercely for the privilege of living inside it. Life at court revolved around rigid ceremony. Even the king's waking and dressing became a ritualized performance attended by courtiers. Luxury was not simply enjoyed, it was displayed as proof of status and royal favor, and the sheer cost of maintaining this spectacle. A palace, a court, an aristocracy whose entire identity was built around appearances placed enormous strain on the same treasury that depended on the taxes squeezed from peasants like the ones we met a moment ago. By the 1770s, the man who inherited this entire structure was Louis XVI. By most accounts, he was not a tyrant driven by cruelty. He was, if anything, notably indecisive. A king more comfortable with hunting and with mechanical hobbies like locksmithing than with the demands of statecraft. Raised within the insulated world of Versailles, he had little direct exposure to the lives of the ordinary subjects, 3 tiers below him on the social pyramid. This matters because the coming crisis would not be caused by one villain making one evil choice. It would be caused by a system so rigid and a monarch so unprepared for the moment history had handed him that even genuine attempts at reform kept arriving too late, too cautiously, or too poorly executed to matter. Beside him stood Marie Antoinette, an Austrian princess sent to France as a teenager to cement an alliance between 2 royal houses. Her reputation for extravagant spending was real, and it made her deeply unpopular at a moment when France's finances were already strained. But one detail deserves particular care, because it has been repeated as fact for more than 2 centuries. There is no reliable historical evidence that she ever said, "Let them eat cake." The phrase appears in French writing before she even arrived in the country, attributed to an unnamed great princess. It became attached to her image later, as public resentment toward the queen intensified, a myth that outlived the truth because it fit the story people already wanted to believe. That, in itself, is worth sitting with. Even before the revolution had begun, the legend was already outrunning the facts. Underneath the ceremony, France's economy was under mounting strain. Agriculture still formed its backbone, supplemented by trade and colonial revenue. alongside a slowly developing industrial base. But decades of costly wars, combined with the staggering expense of maintaining the court at Versailles, had driven the national debt to alarming levels. France was, in effect, a wealthy kingdom, behaving like a kingdom that could no longer afford itself. France did not exist in isolation. It was one power among several: Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, locked in a shifting balance of alliances, rivalries, and periodic wars for territory and prestige across the 18th century. This mattered enormously because so many of those wars were expensive, and France was frequently at the center of them. Every conflict added to the debt already straining the treasury, debt that eventually someone would have to pay. One of those wars would prove unusually significant: France's support for the American War of Independence. French soldiers and officers, including the young nobleman Lafayette, fought alongside American revolutionaries against Britain. It was, on paper, a strategic victory, a blow against a longtime rival, but it came at enormous financial cost, deepening France's debt crisis at precisely the wrong moment. And it carried something back across the Atlantic that no treasury could measure: ideas. Soldiers who had fought for a cause built on notions of liberty and self-governance returned home to a kingdom still built on divine right, rigid hierarchy, and feudal obligation. The contradiction did not go unnoticed. Given everything we've just described, a fair question emerges: why did the French endure this for so long? The answer is layered. Fear of punishment was real and severe. Tradition ran deep, reinforced generation after generation. Religion framed the entire order as divinely sanctioned, making resistance feel like sin rather than justice. Education, where it existed, rarely encouraged questioning the structure that provided it. And perhaps most importantly, there was no widely available alternative model of government to imagine reaching for. You cannot easily demand a system you cannot picture. Silence, in other words, was not simple passivity. It was the product of centuries of careful, overlapping design. By the 1780s, the pressures we've traced through this entire video, the taxes, the debt, the rigid hierarchy, the returning soldiers with new ideas, began converging at once. Poor harvests and drought drove up the price of bread, the one commodity ordinary Parisians could least afford to lose. The national debt, worsened by war after war, pushed the crown toward a fiscal crisis it could no longer quietly manage. Attempts to tax the nobility met fierce resistance from a class unwilling to surrender its privileges. And meanwhile, Enlightenment thinkers had spent decades circulating ideas about reason, natural rights, and the legitimacy of government. Ideas now spreading further than ever through pamphlets, newspapers, and the crowded, argumentative conversations of Parisian coffeehouses. The attitudes of ordinary people were beginning, for the first time in generations, to shift. For centuries, the old European order had remained standing, a machine of crowns, altars, and inherited obligation so vast that it seemed less like a human construction than a law of nature. But for the first time, its foundations were beginning to shake, and what came next would not simply reform that machine, it would tear it apart.